Okay, thank you, Pastor Yu Yong, always one of my bright students. And also thank you, Dicky, for hosting. Dicky and my wife were classmates when they were doing their masters, so great to meet old friends again. Um, I realize your church is now going through the book of Ezekiel over 2.5 months. So these two sessions on Zoom will be providing with you an overview. And the overview, I think, is especially useful for a long book like Ezekiel, which has 48 chapters. I often liken it to like visiting a new country, which is very strange and very new to many of us. So if we were to go to a new country, I would get a road map, and then I would find a tour guide. And so together with a road map, a tour guide, as we travel and move around, the guide will explain the things that we see. So these 2 Sundays, I will be your guide, and the notes will be like a road map to help you see the country of Ezekiel, okay, so that we have a better grasp of it, being more familiar. And once you understand the bigger context, when you locate individual stories within it will be much easier. Okay, so this is what I'll be doing these 2 weeks. Okay, so as I said, it has 48 chapters, quite long. So today we're going to cover quite a lot of the material, and so I will have to see how fast we can go. Unfortunately, next week will be shorter number of chapters. The reason is because I divide it here at this point, so that today we are actually covering 32 chapters. Next week, we are covering only about 16 chapters, so it's actually almost half the length. The reason is because of this natural flow in the book. The first 3 chapters of the book are basically the introduction to this man and his calling. Then immediately you find his preaching begins. And his preaching is basically negative on this side, because he's preaching oracles of judgment. And there are 2 parts to it. The first part, he's preaching oracles to his own people back home, Jerusalem, the capital, and the southern kingdom of Judah, which is still there, but in his last days before his final fall to Babylon. And here, from Babylon, he's preaching these prophecies to remind the people. Then the other half of it is prophecies directed to foreign nations that surrounded the country of Judah, and often in a way has a share in the fortunes of the nation. And so sometimes the foreign nations join in to exert pressure on God's people. So the prophet also has a word against these people. So we use a technical name, OAN, Oracles Against Nation. This is a standard scholarly nomenclature to refer to these very particular prophecies, each one directed to a certain nation. So today we're looking at only negative oracles. Next week, we will then swing and look at all the positive oracles, because these are our oracles of salvation. Once the city has fallen, he now turns and began to preach hope and salvation to the exiles in Babylon, and ending the book with a series of visions of how God will restore the people back to the land, and God will build a huge new temple. Okay, so today we will just focus on all the negative part. So just a little refresher: who is this man Ezekiel? We know he's a priest, and priest in the Old Testament is a vocation that is passed down from father to son. So it's hereditary. So we are told of the name of his father, and we can almost safely presume his father was as well a priest. But he was an out-of-job priest because he couldn't begin his ministry. The year when he was supposed to start off his ministry, he was unfortunately exiled to Babylon. So here is where Jerusalem is, and Babylon is here. So he was exiled in the year 597, the first time Nebuchadnezzar defeated the city of Jerusalem. And we find the king, Jehoiachin, and the royal court officials in the court craftsmen, priests, generals, soldiers, all these people, all the elite were, in a sense, deported all the way to Babylon so that the government could use them. So they follow the river, go up the Euphrates and come back down almost 1,500 miles away. So he found himself out of a job and ended up being a farmer, because we find that in chapter 1, he appears at a place called the Keba Canal, or in some translations, river, but actually it's not a river, it's a man-made waterway. So it's actually a canal in which you can find all through the Euphrates, they built canals to irrigate the land. So he was in one of those canals called Tel Abib at Keba River. And there he received a double vocation. Firstly, to be a prophet. That was his first vocation. A prophet, a Nabi, is simply a mouthpiece for God. You speak what God's words are given to you, and you speak on behalf of God to the people. And God told him he will also have a secondary vocation, which will come into light and play in the second half of the book, and that's to be a watchman. And to be a watchman is to always give warnings to the people from your watchtower as you scan the horizon for enemies that comes. So he had this double vocation. In the first part of the book, he will be that prophet speaking oracles of God to the people. And once the city has fallen and the exile will continue, then he takes over that more the secondary vocation of being a watchman. We'll talk about this as we cover those chapters. Okay, what was his ministry? His ministry is not like some of us will often imagine, writing a long letter to people suffering in exile from the comfort and safety of your own aircon home. No, he's actually not an armchair theologian. He is with the exiles in Babylon. So God actually sent a prophet there in Babylon to speak to the people, so that it's not a person back home in Jerusalem, not in exile, and then writing from safety and comfort. It's difficult to sometimes encourage people when you are, in a safe and secure position and writing to people who are suffering and tell them to hang on there. This audience, when you read some of the verses like in chapter 2, verse 5, you find that they are not an easy audience. Like sometimes you do find people like this in the churches. Stiff-necked, stubborn, slow to respond, slow to believe, those who constantly sin against God and then now reaping what they've sown. These are God's own words used to describe his audience in Babylon. People who refuse to believe that they are here in exile for a long haul. They all think that, somehow God will defeat the Babylons and then we will go back home and the exile will be over quickly. They just refuse to see sometimes the writing on the wall. So what was his specific task? One single purpose, and that was for his fellow Judahites from the southern kingdom of Judah to come back to God, not to perhaps syncretize their faith, turn towards other gods, and especially the temptation was to turn to the gods of Babylon. Because in Babylon, you have a pantheon of gods headed by Marduk. So it's very, or sometimes it's also called Bel or Nebo. You have all these different names. It's very tempting to think that, well, Babylon defeated Judah, and therefore the gods of Babylon must be greater than our God, Yahweh. And some people, in the end, sometimes even turn to these gods and began to worship. So his main task was to tell the people, hang on there, come back to God. Don't look for a quick end to exile. You'll be a total of 50 old years in exile. In the meantime, don't lose hope. Okay, hang on. And the exile will be quickly over. Jeremiah had predicted 70 years. 70 is often a round number in the Old Testament. And many people stick to it as if it's a literal number. But if you look at the actual years of the exile, Babylon fell in 587. Cyrus defeated Babylon in 539, issued an imperial edict, and the next year, 538, the people began to return home in batches. So it's only about 50 years. So not actually a full 70. I think, thank God for that, because God obviously shortened the length so they don't have to spend a full 70 years in exile. 50 years is long, but not as long as the first exile of the Northern Kingdom. The Northern Kingdom of Israel went to exile in 722 BC and they never came back home. They were dispersed all over the Assyrian Empire. And today we talk about the 10 lost tribes. Obviously lost forever, assimilated, intermarried, mixed with all the people, and probably losing their ethnicity. Thank God the Judahites' exile was only 50 years, and eventually they came back home and rebuilt their nation, although not independent, but as a province under Babylon. The first three chapters, we find details of his calling. It is amazing calling because many of the prophets, you find the calling is quite short. Jeremiah, only one chapter. Ezekiel, Isaiah has also one chapter, chapter 6. But Ezekiel, you find his chapters spread over three. His calling spread over 3 chapters. So give us a lot of idea to see what was God doing. 2 dates are provided for the year of his calling. So when we read the opening verses, you find 2 figures that pops up in 2 verses next to each other, chapter 1 verse 1 and chapter 1 verse 2. One starts off with a very obscure figure in the 30th year. Okay, and then the next one talks about the 5th day of the month, and of course the 4th one is already referred in the earlier verse, and telling us that this is the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. Taking the 2, we can see the first one probably refer to his age, because 30 is a significant number. When you read Numbers 4, verse 3 and 30, priests are counted from the year they begin at the age of 30 until they serve until about 50 years of age. So they serve almost only 20 years of active service before they retire. So 30 was the age they begin their ministry. So Ezekiel was probably hinting in the 30th year, the year when I will actually begin my active role as a fully trained priest. He found himself in exile. And then verse 2 tells us that 5 years after the exile, on the 5th day of the 4th month, then God appeared. And that will therefore help us to calculate that his calling came in June 593 BC. Because it's 5 years after the first deportation to Babylon. The first deportation happened in 597 BC. 5 years after that, 5 years of being a farmer, God called Ezekiel now to become a prophet. So very detailed datings, which you find only in the books of Ezekiel, Haggai, and Zechariah. The reason is because these are priests. And being priests, they're probably intelligentsia, illiterate. And so they're very detailed in their numbering of the oracles, dating the oracles. So the oracles come and they have dating. So in Ezekiel's book, you find a series of oracles, all with datings, what day or what month, in what year. So here we are told he therefore began his ministry after 5 years as a farmer, then God finally called him. And how God called him? God appeared in a vision, a theophany. A theophany comes, of course, from 2 Greek words, theos, which is the word for God, and panos, which is the word for face. So theophany, the face of God. So we use that to talk about appearance, the appearance of God, how God appeared to Ezekiel in a very fantastic vision in a desert storm. If you go to a desert, there are these huge desert storms caused by the sirocco winds. These are huge winds that blow in summer, and it can be a blinding desert storm, generated by the wind. All the sand will be flying. And he sees this huge desert storm, and in the midst there, of course, he sees God accompanied by the 4 living creatures. I often tell my students, if you can perhaps read this first chapter and try to paint or draw what Ezekiel saw I wonder what the image will turn out. Okay, because you have those four living creatures with four faces, three pairs of wings. You have a wheel within the wheel with eyes around the rim. God sitting on that mobile throne above a firmament. It's really difficult to try to describe the human language, the appearance of God. And so that vision was where God will speak to him, and God will then commission him to be a prophet, a mouthpiece. But it's not an easy task because he's sent to the rebellious house of Israel. Israel used in the general sense of all God's people. It's a people who will not listen, stiff-necked and stubborn. And so God asked Ezekiel, eat the scroll that he provides. Very interesting. It's like a metaphor of saying, you eat and the words will become part of you, and then you'll be entrusted to speak those words. So thank God today we don't have to eat scrolls of scripture before we can become a preacher for God's word. But here was like a very metaphorical way of saying that, God's word will now be in you. It's like the Chinese people, we burn the amulets, and then they mix the ashes with water and you drink it and it becomes part of you. Here he literally eats the scroll to remind him God's word will now be within you, and you are now supposed to speak God's word truthfully. Okay. And it's not easy words to speak, like Jeremiah struggles. Those words, he says, if I don't preach it, it becomes a fire in his bones. If I preach it, it's only one message: judgment, judgment, judgment. And so people just don't understand. So here he was asked to preach, and we know the moment he takes on this role from chapter 4 onwards, the first messages that he began to preach are all oracles of judgment. And to prepare him, we come to chapter 3, the first 3 chapters, part of the calling. God will make his face as hard as flint. Flint is a stone which is very hard, which we use, for example, in our lighters, cigarette lighters. There's a piece of flint stone where we rub against it and then you create a spark. So flint is actually a very hard type of stone. And God said, I'm going to make your face as hard as flint so that you can face whatever rejection from the people. So there's already a bit of a warning from God. Your message will not fall upon people willing to listen. Just like Isaiah in his commissioning in chapter 6. And he will be told to preach to deaf ears. And he lamented, how long, God? And then God says, as long as is needed until all these things come to pass. So Ezekiel likewise is told it's not going to be an easy task preaching to people who will not listen. And so prior warning, you have to make your skin, your face, as hard as flint. Like our Chinese people say, min pei hao. You have to really tahan all the rejection and the difficult adverse reactions of the people. And then finally, in the last part of the chapter, we find him carried by the Spirit to the exiles at a place called Tel Abib, which of course means the hill. Tel is a hill, Abib is springtime. And today, you can see this is the name of the capital of Israel. They use a V in modern Hebrew for a B without the dot. So Aviv, we always pronounce this as Tel Aviv, not Tel Abib. Okay, it doesn't start syllable is a soft. So that's why modern people use a V. Tel Aviv, hill of spring. So he was deposited there near this place, and he was told, therefore, now he will also function as a watchman to watch over the people because they are in his charge. And each time the Spirit empower him, he will speak. When he's not speaking, he is dumb. When Spirit comes upon him, he speaks. So the people will know he's speaking on behalf of God. Because the rest of the time, he cannot speak, like the father of John the Baptist, Zechariah. The moment he comes out of the temple, having seen the angel Gabriel, he's dumb and he couldn't speak until he writes down the name of his son on the tablet when John was born, and his name shall be called John, and then his tongue was loosened. So in the same way, Ezekiel was dumb. Each time, only when Spirit speaks, give him the words to speak, then his tongue will be loosened. That was a prophetic sign act, as if to tell the people, he is speaking words from God, and therefore pay attention to those words. The moment all this is over, then he begins his preaching, which is the rest of the chapter. Okay. And so you find that in this whole block from chapter 4 to 32, they are all oracles of judgment, negative speech. Okay. There are two parts of negative speeches. Both are equally negative. He starts off first with his own people, the capital, Jerusalem, and the people back home in Judah. He will spend almost 21 chapters targeting his own people because they were still harping and hanging on to the hope that somehow maybe the exile will be over quickly. God will raise up maybe another adversary against Babylon and then set us free, and then we all will return home from exile. But those oracles of judgment will squash all those rumors and all those hopes. No, we are not going to go back home. We will be here for a long haul. It's going to be the next 40 over years from the time of his preaching in 593. Only once he finished this, then he will focus the oracles of judgment, but this time against the foreign nations, the neighboring countries that border the country of Judah. Because some of these nations were also guilty. They also took part in the initial oppression of God's people. So they are also responsible. And so God says they will also not get away. They too will be judged. So quite a long block. So what we do is we split it up. And usually it's split up into 6 smaller sections. So you can see 4 to 7, because they come in blocks of material related to each other. So there are 6 of these blocks. 4 to 7, we all concern what will happen to Jerusalem and Judah. And so basically it's a message of destruction and followed by exile, which is the ultimate curse. In Deuteronomy 27, 28, 29, you see there's a whole list of these curses and blessing. God told the people, I am a covenant God and I covenant with you, my people. If you obey me, I will bring you the covenant blessings. But if you break the covenant, you invoke upon yourself the curses. So the curses involve things like God will send drought, pestilence, famine. God will send the sword, which is war, and the ultimate curse, pembuangan, exile from the land. So God already warned them with those curses that they will come. So in the history of Israel, you find God already sounded out curses like this. In the time of Ahab, 9th century, the northern kingdom had a very bad drought of 3.5 years in the time of Elijah and King Ahab. And there was really a warning to God that Elijah was telling Ahab, you marry Jezebel and you're worshipping all her gods of Baal, and you have these prophets, 450 prophets sitting in your court, all paid by the king. God's already warning them. And then in the time of Joel, there was this locust plague. 4 types of locusts came, one after another, and ate up everything that was green, destroyed the harvest. In the time of Amos, there was this earthquake. And Amos, he's preaching 2 years before the earthquake. Obviously, in the 8th century, it must have been a very devastating earthquake. Today's archaeologists have actually discovered some traces of this 8th century earthquake. Okay, it's amazing. Then, of course, one by one, all this war will come, and the ultimate curse, of course, was exile. 8 to 11, now God gives the reasons. Why must destruction and exile come? And so God lists the reasons because of the people's unforgivable sins. And we will look at that when we come to these 3 chapters. In the midst of preaching to the people in exile, there were people who were challenging Ezekiel. Some of the people who listened to his audience, they didn't look up to him as a true prophet. They think that maybe, you're out of your mind. How can God be doing this to his own people? There were also false prophets who claimed to speak on God's behalf. They were also challenging his message. So much so that you find the elders came and they wanted to find out whether Ezekiel is a message true. And God will have a very challenging message to these elders. Then 15 to 17, he switches now to preaching using prophetic parables. Parables are stories which contain one main truth And he uses parables, three parables. One, Jerusalem like a uses tree of the grapevine, Jerusalem like a prodigal daughter, and then a parable about two great eagles and swooping away and carrying away the Davidic kings, one to Babylon, one to Egypt, and using these parables to tell what is happening in the history and the life of the people. 18 to 19, and then tackling one important issue that the exiles were raising up. They were saying it's not fair. We are in exile, but it's our forefathers from the 8th century, from the 7th century, from the 6th century who sinned. And now we are the ones in the 6th century going to exile, and we are suffering on their behalf. And so Ezekiel will tackle this important issue of now everyone will be individually responsible for their own sins. And then again, back to parable, and this time from eagles switching to two young lions, and again, a parable of the vine. Okay. Then the last part of the oracles of judgment against its own people, using lessons from history, but retelling them in a very different way. Especially the parable of two sisters, Ohala and Oholiba, very interesting allegories or parables of the two kingdoms of northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And finally ends with the mention of how Jerusalem will be besieged and how it will fall. And then you have a prophetic sign connected with that. And then that ends his preaching of negative oracles to his own people before he swing over to now, what about the other nations? Okay, so 6 blocks of material. So let me quickly cover them. So in your sermons, you'll perhaps be listening to an exposition of one of those chapters in depth. So I'm only giving an overview. So the first block, those chapters 4, 5, 6, you find that this is basically his message of doom and destruction. There is no escape. As he preached, he tells the people, God will bring the destruction, and so he will act out some of his message. So unfortunately, you find him acting out. So one time he lie down on his side and then make a little clay model of the city of Jerusalem. He lie down on his side and face it for how many days on one side, turn over to the other side. All this was acting out the message so that when finally the destruction comes, then he put an iron piece between himself and the clay model of Jerusalem. And of course, that means it was representing the people's sin. God will not look at the city anymore because the people's sins have blocked God's grace and favor. So the city will fall and be destroyed. Basically, he was like acting out the message to the people who were still hanging on with hopes that the city of Jerusalem will survive. Maybe God will raise up another nation to attack Babylon and free us. His 3 chapters here entirely spells out no, there will be no salvation. The city will face God's wrath. So using 3 prophetic sign acts to illustrate the message. Amazing. So it's like a modern day preacher. Today, we don't have to act out, thankfully, but we can perhaps use an AVL, audio visual aid. Maybe we show a video clip, we show a PowerPoint. But in those days, you have to probably act it out. And the poor guy had to shave his head, use his hair to illustrate the message. Chapter 7, you find that now he gives the reasons why God's divine punishment must come. In fact, you find 3 times this phrase is there. It's a very powerful phrase. So that you will know I am the Lord. In Hebrew, I am the Lord is just 2 words. Okay. Agni, Yahweh. Agni is the personal pronoun I. And of course, Yahweh is often translated in English with capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, Lord. The word M is not needed. The verb to be is not needed in Hebrew. So, Agni Yahweh, I the Lord, which means I am the Lord. So that you will know I am the Lord. That was the reason given why God will punish the people, so that the people of God will know that God is God. So that you don't play, you see, you don't fool around. I am the Lord. And this will be a very powerful reminder. 3 times in that chapter, God says, so that you will know You see, because you have been taking me too lightly, and you think that judgment will never come, but I'm the Lord. If I say it will come, God says it will come. The next block you find 8, 9, 10, 11, 4 chapters. You find that now, again, a reason is highlighted for why God must destroy, because what was happening in the city of Jerusalem, especially in the temple. In a night vision, Ezekiel was carried in the spirit and there brought to the temple where he saw abominable things being done by the leaders, by the priests within the temple compound. That was really amazing. There was an image of jealousy, which we think perhaps is a foreign god that was placed in the temple itself. And the priests were offering their incense censers to this god. And so God says, how can these things take place within the temple? So that's why God says destruction must come. 9 tells us that judgment will come, not just to other nations, but it must always begin with the house of God. We always say judgment begins with God's people first. Because if we fail, then we have failed to be a witness of God's love and grace, and therefore God must judge us first to show that, before other nations are judged, if God's people themselves sin, we too will be judged. And before Jerusalem is destroyed, God will remove his glory. Because some people argue, if the temple is God's footstool, and God comes down at times in the form of his divine glory, the cloud, the kavod, that cloud of glory. Like in the temple, during Solomon's dedication of the temple, God's glory filled the whole temple until they couldn't see. It was so thick, they couldn't see that they abandoned their service. So God's glory comes down upon the temple. But some people argue, what if God's temple is God's footstool, then how can God destroy his own temple? Here, Ezekiel answered that question. If God's glory is taken away from the temple, then all that is left is just an empty shell of a building. There's no more God's presence. That's why God will destroy Jerusalem and the temple. God's glory will leave. In that graphic chapter of 10, he sees God's glory leave towards the east, cross the threshold of the temple, cross over the Kidron Valley, cross into Mount of Olives, and then go towards the east. Towards the east is a reminder that God has come to where the Babylonians are. Okay. Jerusalem is here. And to go towards the east, that's where Babylon is. Babylon is here. So God's glory has no longer stayed in Jerusalem, where God's people are. It has come now to the exiles in Babylon. That's why what's left is just an empty shell, and it will be destroyed. And then he singled out things that we find amazing. How does he know this? God told him there are 25 wicked counselors who are obviously counseling the king and all these people badly. Remember who was the king? Zedekiah, the uncle of Jehoiachin. And this guy was a guy who wrestled, and he swings towards Egypt because thinking that Egypt will send help. They will become an ally to fight against Babylon. Obviously, these counselors are the pro-Egyptian party. They were the ones who think that Egypt will help us. And they were always pushing the king to turn to Egypt, and Egypt will save us. And Ezekiel, like Jeremiah, constantly warns the people Egypt will not save us. And because these guys counsel badly, they are bringing disaster. So God says they will be judged. Okay? They will be judged severely for what they are doing. So this whole block, therefore, is the reasons. These are the reasons why judgment must come. So you see, worship has gone wrong, gone bad. Okay, and then we have to set example. Judgment comes to God's people always first, and then God already removed. God's presence is already removed. So there's no more claim that God is with us in the temple. The temple is just any other, simply a building. And then all this bad counsel that led the nation down the road to destruction. Okay, four sets of answers are given in this block. Okay. Then you have the third block, 12 to 14. And here you find that people again find it hard to accept and believe in Ezekiel's message. So he had to do another sign. Have an exile's baggage. In time of exile, you don't have time to tell your captors, hey, can I take my big suitcase and then pack all my belongings and go? No, very often you just grab a few things, throw them into a sarong, and tie it up, sling it over your shoulder, and that's it. That's your exile's baggage. So you make a baggage, and then you make a hole in the wall and crawl through it. And the people will ask, hey, crazy man, what are you doing? And he was saying, I'm playing the role of the people in Jerusalem. When the siege by the Babylonians come in 587, it will be so bad, the people will take the night as a cover, and make holes in the walls of the city, and they will try to escape the siege of Jerusalem, and they will crawl and to escape. It was basically saying, the city will fall and the people will know it's going to fall. And yet the people still turn. In Babylon, we know there were false prophets. You can read Jeremiah's letter to the exiles. And he warns them, don't listen to those false prophets. There are also people in Babylon itself, and they were trying to console people, telling people we will return home. No, Jeremiah says they are preaching out of their own imagination. God says, I never call them. Okay. And there were also women prophets selling magic, magic bands to wear and all this, thinking that those amulets, thinking that those things will protect us. Now, notice it had gone into syncretism. You no longer trust God, and you are trusting, all these amulets and bangles and whatever. So again, Ezekiel is told, preach a hard word against those things, because these are leading the people astray. Then comes the elders. They come to visit Ezekiel and ask for a message. And God told them, but they are not genuine. Call them to repent. Why? They have taken idolatry into their hearts. They are not really genuine, and the pious who come to me, ask them to repent. And then Ezekiel uses a great example. He says, even if today we have Noah, Daniel, and Job, three great intercessors of Israel's in Israel's history, Noah in Genesis, Job, although Edomite in the book of Job, but which has been assimilated to the people of God, Daniel, who perhaps contemporary now together with Ezekiel, even in these three great intercessors in the sea, they cannot save Israel by the acts of prayer. That means it's so bad, God will not even listen to them. Remember, these are people who stood on behalf of God, and they spoke messages, and they did their work, but even then God will not. God will send 4 acts of judgment. And look at all this. These are all in a sense, part of all the covenant curses, okay? Like what you will read in Deuteronomy 27 to 29, those series of pestilence, wild beasts, famine, sword, all these things are there. Again, God's like final warnings to the people, turn around, if not, these are the final warnings before the ultimate curse, exile. This time exile, again in 587, a third deportation of people. There were 3 deportations in all, 597, 593, and then 587. And the final one, the city will be destroyed and burned, and the temple will be burned. So again, you can see frantically warning the people to change their mind as if, you can save them. Then here you have series of preaching in terms of teaching in parables. Very interesting. If you think that Jesus used a lot of parables, no, actually the prophets also use a lot of parables in the Old Testament. Single parable describing Jerusalem like a piece of wood of the vine. The vine is a grape tree. A grape tree vine is very thin and narrow, and when it grows old, it becomes ngah. So it is not a straight piece of wood that you can use to make planks. When the vine has finished fruiting and you can't get any more grapes, it's actually not good for anything. You throw it as fuel for burning because it is very thin wood and it's ngah. You can't use the wood for any other purposes. You can't make furniture out of it unless you want to make a spoon. But make a spoon, but the spoon will be ngah like that. The wood will be like this. You see. So no use. So the interpretation, the city is like that. The city of Jerusalem will be thrown into the fire, will be burned. Single parable. 16 is the longest chapter, 63 verses in all. Using again a parable of Jerusalem like a prodigal daughter. God had pity on her when she was born, took care of her, cleansed her, and all this. She grew up, God dressed her up nicely, but she became faithless. And then you find this phrase used 5 times in the chapter. She played a whore. That means you prostitute yourself. Each time she prostituted herself with lovers, chasing Assyria, chasing after Egypt. And again, judgment will come because you are no longer faithful to God, because God like woo her to become his wife, but she went and played the whore. So judgment will come, but notice God's grace persists. God will make sure eventually the covenant that God made with her earlier will somehow come to an end. So notice in the midst of all this negative preaching, there is hope. That's why those people who think that Old Testament is always just law, judgment, and the New Testament is only hope and salvation is wrong. Old Testament equally has stories of grace and hope. And here it ends on a very positive note. God will remember the covenant and bring her back and covenant with her. Then some more parables, this time 2 eagles. That's an error in your notes. I typed in as Assyria, but actually it should be Babylon. Two nations, one representing Babylon, one representing Egypt, both come into the land of Israel and swoop away the top part of the cedar tree. And each one actually is a reference, okay? So it's like saying, well, Babylon took the last legitimate king Jehoiachin and his exile. That was in the year 597 together with Ezekiel. And then replaced by someone else who was his uncle. Okay, and this guy, of course, was influenced by the pro-Egyptian party and all this. And God was saying that in the midst of it, one day God will restore back the rightful ruler. So again, there is a positive note. It ends there. Although here you have the negative part. So using a parable, or you can say even an allegory to explain the history of what's going on, the history of Israel, but ends it back on a positive note that there's still hope. God will make sure one day the rightful owner, the rightful ruler will sit back on the throne, not the illegitimate. Many Jews didn't look up to this guy as an illegitimate king. You know, this Ezekiel counted his calling in the year when King Jehoiachin was exiled. They all look up to him as the true king. But unfortunately, he was the one exiled, and he spent his life in exile. And the last mention of him is in 2 Kings chapter 25, where he set free from prison. He sits in the palace, eat in the king's table with Nebuchadnezzar's son, Evil Merodach. And so this guy was the replacement, and people didn't look up to him as legitimate. So one day God will make sure a rightful king will sit on the throne. So that gave a little bit of hope. Give a bit of hope to the people. Hopefully one day maybe Jehoiachin may return home from exile. Okay. 1819 still continue with teaching of using parables, but this time he quotes a proverb. So the people were making sayings. There were many sayings that people were saying in the exile. He quote one of them. This was the people saying, and he says, well, God is disputing this challenge, and from now on, God will turn it other way around. Now, what was this popular proverb that people were saying? The exile was saying, our fathers who lived in the 8th century, the 7th century BC, they're the ones who sinned, eaten sour grapes. They sinned, okay? But now we, the children, the 6th century people, okay, we are the ones facing the pain of eating the sour grapes. We are the one now in exile. So the people are saying, therefore, unfair. Okay, so they are quoting that there's a certain unfairness. If God were to punish, He should be punishing our forefathers. They should be the ones that go to exile, not us. See, we are the ones now facing this. And true enough, Ezekiel said, yes, from now on, God says, everyone is now responsible for your own sins. So if you sin, you'll be responsible for your own sin. So God says, yes, those days there was this corporate responsibility thing. Corporate responsibility means one person's sin, everybody feels it as a group. So It is a very powerful understanding. One person sin, one member, the body suffers, the whole body suffers. That is corporate responsibility. So it's true, but yet now there is also individual responsibility. From now on, we cannot push it and say, don't blame me, lah. My forefathers sinned, so now I'm now reaping the reward. But we too are also responsible for ourselves. If we sin, we don't push the responsibility to others. We face our own sins. So now, from now on, corporate responsibility is balanced with individual responsibility. Okay. Then again, using parable, and this time from eagles chained to lions. And these two lions are used for the Davidic kings. Again, no interpretation is given, no names of the kings are mentioned. We can guess perhaps it is these two. The first lion was Jehoash. Jehoash reigned only 3 months, and the Egyptians, led by Pharaoh Necho, who lost the fight against the Assyrians at Megiddo. On the way back, he took this king and took him back as a prisoner back to Egypt and installed the brother. And it would be this guy, and he sits in there, but this is the nephew of Jehoash, because there's another guy called Jehoiakim, okay, who is the father of Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim is the brother of Jehoash. So Jehoash replaced by Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim reigned 10 years and is a father of Jehoiachin. And he died and left the young son sitting on the throne. This guy only lasted 3 months. The Babylonians took him to exile. So it's a picture about these two young lions, and it's basically saying that that's why they fell. And you read the whole chapter of 19, God is never mentioned at all. Is absent, not mentioned in the whole chapter. It's as if, well, that's because you guys play your own politics. You depend on Egypt and all this. This is what you get. You reap what you sow. You don't trust me, you reap what you sow. This is what you get. Okay. So 2 parables. The vine, of course, is also an interpretation of how vine also, if you will take it as equivalent to the same, then you're talking about the same thing, the removal of the kings. All this is basically because you don't trust me. You reap what you sow. You play your political alliances. That is the price of all this. The final block, the 6th block that we're looking at in all the negative preaching. Now you have 2 slides here. 20, now we have a dating. We can date it. And this is actually his last oracle. So it is out of place because the out of sync, okay? But it has been placed here for a certain reason. We don't have time to explain it. But it's dated here 597, which means he started preaching from 593, and his last message is sorry, not this chapter. His last chapter is 571, so not this chapter. Sorry, I jumped too fast. So 591 is about 2 years after his preaching, and what is happening is he's using history of Israel to repeat. That talks about Israel, the history repeating itself. Okay, and it's like a cyclic pattern of the book of Judges, that constant story of failure, and especially not learning their failure. And God lists out all the abominable things that the people had been doing. 21 is quite long, 32 verses. You can divide it into 4 units. And the common word that appears in all 4 is the word sword. Okay, the word sword is used 16 times in the whole chapter. 32 verses used 16 times. It's almost like is used once every 2 verses. Wow, that is quite a lot. Okay, so sword represents destruction. Sword is the instrument that God used, and God already said, "My sword has already come out from the sheath." You know, like the Malay people say, if you pull out your kris there, it will be stained with blood because you are going to fight already. God has really drawn out the sword from the sheath. That means judgment will come. But this sword is God is going to use the sword of Babylon. Babylon is the instrument of destruction. The Babylonians will come and will destroy God's own people. So God uses a Gentile nation as his instrument. And that made it so difficult for the people to accept. How can God do this? How can God use a foreign nation like the Babylonians, a cruel people, as Habakkuk says, no, a cruel nation, the Chaldeans, and God used them to inflict his wrath upon his own people. Well, God can use anybody as his instrument, Gentile nations. God will use Cyrus, a Gentile ruler, to also bring salvation. When you do 3 units, we can divide it in this way. Okay, we have time, you can go back to the notes. Each one deal with one topic, each of these verses. One is about the city of Jerusalem, which will reap the punishment. Okay, and then the house of Israel that has become dross. It's supposed to be silver, supposed to be glittering like silver. It has become dull like dross. That's why it has lost its shine, and God will bring the punishment. And then it's about how judgment comes because the land is a land that is not cleansed. Okay, and this is the chapter where we have that famous phrase: "Then God looks for a man who will build up the wall and who will stand before God on behalf of the land." God's not looking just for intercessors, but for people to prepare the hole in the wall, that breach that God will. So God looks, and then God says, "I found no one righteous to do the job," and that's why the land will face judgment. Then 23, another parable using now the two sister cities. These are the capital cities of the northern kingdom, which is already long gone, but using it as a story, and then Jerusalem, the southern kingdom. So instead of calling Israel, Judah, Samaria, Jerusalem, they use a story of 2 sisters, Oholah and Oholibah. And they're both married to the same spouse, and the same spouse as you can see is the Assyrians, because they all trust, thinking that the Assyrians will now save us from Babylon. And even in southern kingdom, Manasseh himself, the most wicked king, also allied himself with the Assyrians. So it's basically a story, an extended metaphor about Israel and Judah's international politics and their failures. Okay, they were playing all these political games, making political alliances, thinking that we will survive. We don't need God by doing all this, but all these policies are doomed to failure because they don't trust God. They are trusting in political alliances and nations. A very good word for us today in Malaysia, where we think that salvation may come to all the political alliances, BN, PN, PH, whatever. Well, perhaps we forgot that we too can ally ourselves with God. And the last chapter concludes again with the negative preaching on Judah and Jerusalem. And here it ends with the story of Jerusalem will be besieged, and God will not deliver Jerusalem. And then with that sign act, we are told his wife died the same time when he preached that assignment, that oracle. And then surprisingly, God told Ezekiel, "Do not turn up for a funeral. Be absent. In your absence, that will be a sign act." Because after the funeral, people will then ask this crazy man, "Where are you? Why did you turn up for the funeral of your wife?" And then he will explain, "I'm playing the role of God. My wife is the city of Jerusalem. When the city falls, it's like my wife dies. I play the role of God. I will not be present. I will not even mourn, for my wife." Terrible to be acting like that, because it means that Ezekiel never saw his wife for the last time. And then the last part, the message, his mouth is again open. Each time he's always dumb. Each time the word comes, then he's open, and then the people will know, there is a prophet among their midst. A real prophet. Because each time he cannot speak. Only when God's Spirit comes upon him, then he opens his mouth and he speaks. Once he finishes speaking, he becomes dumb again. So it's a sign. And this time he opens his mouth and began to speak, and then people then began to realize that he is the true prophet. But it will take till chapter 33 before we see this. Only chapter 33 before we see, because now we will have a whole block of oracles against other nations. Okay. Now, this is something which is found in also other prophets preaching, especially in the two of the major prophets, Isaiah. You find also one whole block of OANs from 13 to 23. In Jeremiah, it's placed towards the end of the book, 46 to 51. In Amos, you find the first two chapters there. He also lists out 8 nations that are targeted by God for judgment. Okay, so you have a series of these which has been rearranged, edited, and now placed together as a block. So in Ezekiel, you also have a whole block of these OANs. So the 3 major prophets and Amos all have a block. What is the purpose of OANs? In the past, people thought that, well, the prophet is a mouthpiece, so therefore he's speaking to these nations. But we cannot imagine that Ezekiel will be able to travel out of Babylon and then go towards all these nations that I mentioned, Edom, Moab, Philistines. No, I don't think he's actually able to go. So then, what's the purpose? He's actually preaching the OAN in the hearing of God's own people. That means the OANs, although target other nations, they are for the hearing of God's people. So that God's people have no reason to argue God is not fair. He's punishing us. See how hard he's punishing us. But about all the other nations, they are also sin. Then here you have this whole block, and it tells the people, well, they can't get away either. All these nations are also equally guilty. So it shows God's people, Judah and Israel, are not alone in suffering misfortune and all this. Other nations will also suffer. It's a way to remind us that God's hand is at work also in other nations. So God is concerned because God is the Lord of all the nations, not just Israel, Judah, but even the nations who do not know God. So when God passed judgment upon all these nations, is to show that the arena of God's work, the arena of God's judgment is the whole world, the whole earth. God is the Lord. Okay, so we have these OANs given, and they're given in the hearing of the exiles, so that they then realize, okay, Edom, Ammon, Philistia, Tyre, Sidon, Egypt, all too will suffer because they too also play these politics. They also step on other people, oppress people. They also do these evil things. God is a fair God. God will also judge them. Now, what do we find in this block of material? Altogether, 7 nations and city-states. Some of them are nations like Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, and Egypt are nations. Tyre and Sidon are city-states, part of Phoenicia. So not all the whole country of Phoenicia is targeted. There are 5 cities in the Phoenician coastline: Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, Tripoli, and Berytos. So you have all these names, biblos. So only 2 are singled out. So only 2 are city-states. The rest are nation-states. Okay. So altogether, 7. Now, 7, of course, give us an idea of something that is perfect or complete. So it is like saying, well, look around you. Judah is here. Okay, let me switch to a different color pen. Okay. Judah. This is Judah. And of course, Babylon is towards the east, far away. Look at all these nations, they are all surrounding. Okay, Ammon. Number 1, Ammon. 2, Moab and Seir. Seir is one of the mountains in the range. 3rd, Edom. Okay. Then fourth, Philistia, the 5 cities of the Philistines, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron. And then the 2 city-states of Tyre and Sidon. Okay, so 5, 6. And then Egypt, which unfortunately is not in the picture here, but Egypt will be the 7 on this side. So they're all, in a sense, neighboring countries that surround on the east side. So notice he swings around like that, swings up, and then take a big swing now towards the west. So it starts from the east, so you can see how he starts. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Okay, so there's a certain pattern. So it's like a loop. Okay, it is like a loop that tells you these are the nations that surrounds our nation, and they have been oppressing us, and part of it. And so God says, I will therefore also judge them, and I will bring this judgment. And of the so-called 7 nations and city-states, it's a bit of unequal treatment because 2 of them gets longer oracles, Tyre and Egypt. You notice Tyre, 3 chapters of the book. Egypt, 4 chapters. So they are long. Whereas the others, you can see, they all share 1 chapter. Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistines. 4 of them share 1 chapter. Sidon has a bit of half a chapter down here, but Tyre gets 2.5 chapters, and Egypt gets the longest 4. So why the unequal treatment? There you can see when we come to those nations. So let's look at them one by one, starting with the first one, which is on the east border of Judah. Remember, Judah is here, and they are the ones towards the east. Immediate neighbor, sorry, not west, to the east. Okay, capital city is Rabbah, Ammon. And today, of course, you can see the name Ammon has been taken up and becomes Amman, the capital city of Jordan. So it's all connected. Okay, and what is the judgment that God will inflict? Because it says here, they came, these people, the Ammonites, they used to cross over the river and raid the nations here. Israel was here, Judah was here. They were the people of the east, they were the desert raiders. They came and raid and all this, and therefore inflict all these things. So God says, well, and they've been attacking, because remember, even start from the story of David. David had to conquer this nation using the general Joab. And so they were always contending, always had to fight free. And especially in the time when Judah had fallen to the Babylons the first time in 597, they actually laughed. Schadenfreude is a German word which means to rejoice over your enemies. Okay. And so God says, I will use people from the east to punish them. God will use other desert raiders that will swing in from the desert, from the Arabian side, and raid their nation, their cities, to punish them. So God used another nation to punish this nation. The reason for this, and the goal, so that these Ammonites will know again, Ani Yahweh, these famous words. Okay, so that means again you will know that I'm the God of Israel, Judah. You attack my people, therefore now I will use a nation, the desert raiders, people of the east, to attack you, so that after this, then you can say, Ani Yahweh, I know now God is the Lord. The next nation is below. Moab is below. Now, Moab is, of course, again, immediate neighbor to the east. Got all my directions wrong. Capital city is Dibon, okay, which is still around today. Okay, and you can see, again, the reason was they also laughed at the downfall of Judah when the Babylonians came and attacked, and they again rejoiced over the downfall, because now the worst part is Moab should have come and helped, because the Moabites are related. The Moabites are related to the Israelites. In the story of, especially you can see, just like the Ammonites are related to the Israelites through Lot and the two daughters. When they escaped the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and the two daughters fled to a cave near the Dead Sea, I think somewhere around here. There is a cave called Cave of Lot. Very interesting. But this is tradition. And so they hid there, and the daughter says, we will know no man in this deserted place. So let's make our father drunk, sleep with him, and we have children. And so out of the children descended from this incestual union, you have the descendants of the Moabites from one of the daughters, and you have the descendants of the Ammonites from another daughter. So the Ammonites, number one, and the Moabites, number two, are both related to the Israelites. In the time when Babylon was attacking, they, instead of helping their own, you can say, cousins, because they are related, because Lot is the nephew of Abraham, they should come and help, but they actually laugh. Again, God will use the people from the east. These desert people will come and swing in, and they will then raid this nation. And actually, Moab was famous as a wheat basket in the ancient world. They will raid it, and again, so that there is this goal, so that people will know, I need Yahweh, so that I'm the Lord. This is a reminder that you guys are connected, because Abraham and Lot were uncle and nephew. And so therefore, the Moabites and Ammonites are, in a sense, distant cousins to the Israelites. And so, blood is taken in water. You should be extending help, but you are laughing and rejoicing over Judah's misfortune. So God will punish the Ammonites and the Moabites. Now you see why these two nations are picked up, okay, for singling out as a judgment. Then swing to Edom. Edom is at the bottom, and eventually Edom will move towards Judah's side and stay underneath there and form the nation of Edomian. So who are the Edomites? Now, Edomites are also related to the Israelites because they are descendants from Esau. Okay, so Esau and Jacob were twin brothers. From Jacob will come the Israelites. And from Esau will come the Edomites. Esau, when he was born, was a very red, hairy baby. So the word Edom is a word which means red. So that when you buy wine in Israel, you want to buy red wine. Wine is yayin. Red wine, yayin Edom, red wine. Okay, so the Edomites are hairy red people like their descendant Edom. So these two are twin brothers. Therefore, they're actually first cousins. And eventually, you will see they are down here in the southeast area. Capital city was Petra, which they eventually abandoned. Okay, so what was the reason for judgment? They acted revengefully against Judah. Okay, we know what happened was that they were always at bad blood. Remember when Israel was in Egypt and it came out in the Exodus story, they came to the land of Edom and wanted to pass through the area and then willing to pay money for the water and the grass which the animals will eat. The Edomites refused. So the Israelites had to swing out beyond the highway, which was the king's highway, into the outer borders and travel a longer route. There was really always bad blood, and Judah, Israel will try to suppress, conquer Edom. Edom will always try to shake it off. So in the time when Judah was now under the misfortunes of facing Babylon, the Edomites again did not help. In fact, they will actually come one day and not even help at all. They will actually come and loot. We know this because you can see Psalm 137. Psalm 137 is a psalm of exile, and they remember the treachery of the Edomites. After the Babylonians had finished destroying the city, the Edomites came. They came and they ransacked the city of Jerusalem one more time. So at the end of this psalm, you find you have this verse. Remember the Edomites. Burn them down to the ground. Okay, so because of their treachery. So what will God do? God will bring a threat of judgment, death by the sword. So the Babylonians will come and they will attack all these other nations. And the Edomites were smart. They will all chabut and run across onto this side and eventually form a nation here, which will become known as Idumea. So the Edomites will then marry the Jews located here, and the descendants will become Idumean Jews. And the most famous Idumean Jew, King Herod the Great. Okay, so that's why people don't like King Herod the Great, because King Herod the Great is half Edomite, half Jew. So again, God says you should have help of all people. You have first cousins, you didn't help. So again, the goal that they will know my vengeance, just as you acted revengefully against my people, now you will taste God's vengeance. So God will bring destruction, war, and sword on Edom. Then swing now to the Philistines. Now the Philistines are not connected with the people of God. The Philistines are people who came from the sea, from the islands of Crete and Cyprus. Okay, they came from these two islands, and they were sea people, sailors, and they settled down in this area: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, 5 cities. Okay, where we have 5 lords, 5 overlords ruling over the 5 cities in the time of the story of Samson. And the reason why they are to be judged, they also acted revengefully, which means perhaps they also took the opportunity to invade the borders of Judah while Judah was suffering. So what will God do? Again, he will bring destruction by war, which means using the sword. Again, so that when God does all these things, then the people will know that Ani Yahweh, that they are facing this God Yahweh. So the cities along here are also singled out. Then you have the 2 city-states of Phoenicia, Tyre. Now, Tyre gets very long. You look at it, it's about 2.5 chapters. The second half of the chapter reserved for Sidon. Okay. Altogether, you can see quite a number of prophecies. Chapter 26 has 4 prophecies. You can divide them up into the 4 parts. And it tells about how they used to side with Israel because they were good friends. Initially, they were good friends with Israel and Judah. Especially King David was a good friend with Hiram of Tyre. And eventually, Solomon bought cedar trees, wood from Hiram of Tyre. So they were initially good friends. And somehow, unfortunately, they sided with Judah against Babylon. Of course, when Babylon comes, Babylon will not tolerate people who challenge them. So Babylon will eventually also destroy Tyre. And Tyre used to have actually 2 cities. One city was in the mainland Tyre. And there was an island off the coast, and that was the island Tyre. If they are ever attacked, the people will be smart. They will all run and chabut and live on the island instead. They can give up this and they will stay in the island. Now, it's difficult to besiege an island because it's surrounded by the sea. You need to have a lot of ships to surround the island. And that island had cliffs, vertical cliffs, which makes it hard to scale the wall. So almost impenetrable. And they boasted in their navy fleet. The Phoenicians were very famous sailors. From Phoenicia, they sailed all over the place, and Phoenicia actually sailed to Africa, landed in Africa, and founded Carthage, which was a colony of Phoenicia. So they were great sailors. So they take pride in their navy. And here there is a lament that even their famous navy will be destroyed. And then 28 is a prophecy against the ruler, the prince of Tyre, for his pride. And here is where very often people take this passage as a reference to Lucifer, to Satan. But initially, you can see it is a prophecy directed to Tyre for his pride and arrogance, because he thought that my island city is impenetrable. Okay, and then they were famous for trade, maritime trade, because of the sea. So maritime trade means they have the cedar trees from the forest, And they also sold what we call Tyrian purple dye extracted from the murex seashell from the sea. The people will dive down into the sea, collect the murex shell, take out the inside organ of the snail, boil it in water, extract the dye, and the dye is worth its weight in gold. So they were rich, and that's why they pride in themselves, and this is a prophecy that that your downfall. And then the prophecy of King of Tyre, again, for his pride. And it's like King Tyre stands as one of the symbols of evil, just like Babylon will be a city as a symbol of evil, of rebellion against God. So all these negative prophecies about Tyre. Sidon, which is just next door, one of the five, you can see the five port cities, was also a famous name in the Old Testament because of Queen Jezebel, who came from Sidon and married King Ahab. So they again also will be targeted, and God will use judgment by war and pestilence upon the city. And again, the reason so that God says, so that they will know any Yahweh, so that I am the Lord. So all these are targeted, and then finishing that one round, swing to the final one, Egypt. Okay, so having covered all these nations here, starts from here, swing, and then now swings to the final one, Egypt. Egypt was towards the west, and you find that Egypt gets 4 chapters. The 4 chapters make up 50% of the OANs, because the OANs are only from 24 to 32. And yet they take up almost 50% of the amount. Why so many? In all, 7 long prophecies. 6 of them provided with datings. Because Egypt was an ally of Judah. And Egypt always promised Judah, I will help you to fight against Babylon. We make an alliance. But unfortunately, Egypt always very slow to come to help because they were actually very smart. Judah and Israel act as a buffer zone. Okay, it's like a buffer zone. So that any enemy that comes from the east and swings down from the north, Assyria, Babylon, will have to face the nations up here. The Philistines, the Phoenicians, Israel, Judah, the Philistines, and then only finally come to Egypt. So they make allies with all these people, and then actually use them like a buffer zone, promising help, but actually hardly come. And so they were actually very treacherous, treachery. They always promise help, but we know from history, either the armies come after the war, after the fight is over, or they never come. You can see all the oracles are negative. It's a way to imagine Ezekiel is telling the people in exile, don't trust this joker, Egypt. They will never come to help us. And you can see all these chapters here. Egypt pride itself with the river Nile. The river Nile is like a symbol of their power and strength. It's like a serpent. It's like a great serpent, like a great dragon. And even Egypt, it says, will fall. And you can see the last prophecy of Ezekiel is here. It's dated, and we can see this is 22 years of preaching. This is his last message. And it says here, Egypt will fall, but then Nebuchadnezzar will not conquer Egypt completely. It will be left to another one who will come. The Persians will come and they will conquer Egypt more completely. But Tyre will be given to Nebuchadnezzar like a payment for his role. He's like an instrument of God, and God will reward Nebuchadnezzar with the island city of Tyre. In fact, Tyre will continue to rebuild itself, and then will face Alexander the Great in the 3rd century. And then Alexander the Great will finally destroy Tyre completely. Then Egypt, again, the only undated oracle, talking about again destruction. And then here is another oracle where it says Pharaoh's armies will be broken, because just as his arms are broken, he will be defeated by Babylon. So you can see those dates we work out from his dating to link with the last king Jehoiakim in exile. We can work out all those dates. So three of the dates here are dated. This one is not dated. And the final ones are here. And you can see up to about 585. So again, using parables, like a cedar tree, Pharaoh will fall to make Nebuchadnezzar God's agent. So the Babylonians will rule for a short while in Egypt. Eventually, the Persians will take over. Then eventually, the Greeks will take over. The Romans will take over. Egypt will never be independent again, but under foreign powers. And then again, a lament because the people continue to trust in Pharaoh in Egypt. But again, Ezekiel is pointing to how God will destroy Pharaoh. And the final humiliation, the story is painted as if Pharaoh himself will descend to Sheol, and all the nations will be aghast as they witness. How can this superpower, Egypt was once a superpower, but itself will be defeated, and the defeat will be so final, they will be witnessed by the nations and the rulers who will be all left in aghast at what's happening. Because Egypt always thought it was a superpower, but it's actually in its it's no longer, it passed its prime. Egypt was already in its final death throes. They themselves will be conquered by Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. And the reason why you have 4 chapters against Egypt was because, remember, this was still providing the hope. They were providing hope, and the exiles in Babylon, the audience of Ezekiel, were still clinging on, thinking that, maybe Egypt will deliver and fight against Babylon, and then we all can go home. Ezekiel has to say, no, Egypt will fall because they failed to keep the promise. Now, if Egypt fall, this is the final ally, then there's no more hope for Judah, and Judah will fall. That's why he has to spend 4 chapters to make sure the people get this message. Don't trust Egypt. They will not help us. We will all be in exile for the long haul. As a way to reflect on this whole block of chapters, 32 chapters, if you look at perhaps the first part where he's preaching the oracles of judgment against his own people, maybe the first question to think about is, are God's judgments fair? Because God targets his own people first. So should God's people be punished? Should people be punished for the sins of their forefathers? Especially chapter 18, the people complain. No, our forefathers sinned in the 8th century, 7th century. Why should we be the ones going to exile? Okay. Then what about the nations around? The other nations say, we don't believe in your God. Why should your God be punishing us? But here perhaps is a reminder to us that God is the Lord of all nations, whether the nations like it or not. Whether the foreign nations acknowledge God, but God is the Lord of all nations, and God is at work in those nations. If they cross the boundaries, if they do things which are bad and wrong, like oppressing people, sending people to exile, God will punish those nations as well. So do we see God also actively at work today among the foreign nations in our midst? Do we see the hand of God in Singapore, in Thailand, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia, in Myanmar, in India, Bangladesh, India, all the nations surrounding Malaysia? Do we see God's hand also actively at work? So then we can then say, well, if God were to punish Malaysia, God is fair because God also punishes all the other nations surrounding us. Okay, so it's a long overview. Unfortunately, because we divide this. If we were to do it in 4 weeks, then I will have subdivided the chapters. But next week will be a shorter block. But this week, because we are looking at negative oracles, it's good to see the whole picture. So his preaching began first with his own people, the negative oracles, a whole block towards Judah and Jerusalem. Then he also focused on the surrounding nations, those nations that surround Israel like a loop. He covered all of them, and then he swings to the last ally, and there God will punish and remove the ally. So if you hear it as a exile in Babylon, if you listen to his message, then you realize there's no hope. There's no hope of any salvation, of defeating Babylon and returning home. No, we are going to be here. That's why chapter 3, next week we'll look at it. The people come as exiles. The city has fallen back home, and the news comes, and then he's finally vindicated. And people turn to him and tell Ezekiel, we now know you are a prophet. We now know you are speaking the truth. And from there, you find 33 onwards, he swings his whole preaching to positive oracles of salvation and hope. So to be a preacher, sometimes you look at the situation. What is God asking me to say? I preach Sunday sermons every time, always just salvation, comfort, and hope? Or this time to sometimes take out the big stick? You have to preach judgment at times. If you sin, you have to sometimes preach judgment and hard messages, even though it's not nice to listen to, but sometimes we do have to preach those hard messages. Okay, pass it back to the host.
All right, thank you, Rabbi, for your insights and a very in-depth exposition to the book of Ezekiel in 1.5 hours. We covered more than half the book. Wow, that's amazing. All right, so I think there are quite a few questions. I know some of you have already messaged me with your questions, so you can keep your questions coming. For those of you at Studio One, if you have questions, please tell your questions to Joshua, our very well intern, and he will help you write down your questions, and I'll ask it for you.
Okay, so first question was the one that I mentioned about Ezekiel 28, reference to the prince of Tyre, and most people think that is Satan. As I said, initially, when you look at the text, it is referring to the king of Tyre. Okay. If prophecy is fulfillment, then of course we can reuse that prophecy and refer it to maybe Satan or whatever name you use one more time, you see. But always look at the initial context, who is the initial reference point to. So I think if you look at those chapters, Tyre has 2.5 chapters. It is a chapter that refers to the prince of Tyre, the ruler of Tyre. The language used, of course, again, language in poetic text can be sometimes bombastic because poetry. And so they use all this sometimes they use mythological language. Sometimes they use language which we have reference points back to the Old Testament. So you are the seal of perfection, full of wisdom. Because the king boasts that we are powerful, we are great, we are rich, we are impenetrable, we will never fall. So use those language and of course some people argue those language border on to almost divine or sub-divine, and that's where people then look at the text as referring to Lucifer. One of the reasons is because there is this phrase where it says, "You are the morning star." Unfortunately, in the Latin, it's translated, therefore, and then people say morning star is Lucifer. Trust me, if you read Hebrew, the word used here, the morning star, refers to Venus. Okay, and so it's nothing to do with Lucifer. Lucifer is a church tradition used to interpret the text from the Latin. So the text, when it describes, say, you are the morning star, it's just you are Venus, the planet Venus. That is the name of the word in Hebrew. See, so there's nothing there to read it as Lucifer. So unfortunately, people tend to read that, and I think it's only the King James Bible that uses that. Okay, so unfortunately, if you read other translations, no, you don't get that phrase Lucifer there. You are the morning star is basically Venus. Venus is the star that you see in the evening and in the early morning. That is the so I don't think it's referring to initially Satan. Okay, it's referring to the king of Tyre. But that type of bombastic language, when he takes pride in himself, can again perhaps be taken out and reused one more time to refer to the devil. Even the name Lucifer is not found in the Bible. Again, that is from church tradition. So there is a good book called Good and Evil in the Bible. It's a very huge thick book. You want to trace the origins of Satan, you can see how the name all came from there. Satan is a word which comes from the Greek Satanas. We shorten it, capitalize the S, and it becomes his name. Lucifer is more from the Latin tradition. You don't have these names in the Bible. The devil comes from the Greek word diabolos. Okay, so and you can see that diabolos, the devil, is where we get the English word diabolical. And then you have the word demon, and demon comes from the Greek daimones. So it's all from Greek: daimones, demon, diabolos, devil, satanas, Satan. Okay, so they all refer to different classes of these spiritual beings. They are not actually capitalized names of things, unfortunately. We tend to capitalize and make it into satanas. Okay. So I know it's a text that people tend to read it, but as I said, the original context is directed to the prince of Tyre. And people see then the resemblance of that text as referring to Satan. Okay. Second question, how did the exiles take the words of Ezekiel? Were they more receptive? Did scripture say anything? No. Chapter 2, verse 5, already God described them as stiff-necked, stubborn. They will not listen to you. Therefore, I have to make your face as hard as flint. They will keep coming to him and he will keep scolding them and they will still not receive it. Even when the elders visit him, God already said they carry idols in their hearts. They are not receptive. It will take chapter 33. 33 next week, you will see when a man comes bringing news about the fall of Jerusalem. Then people realize, oh, this man was preaching the truth. So it was really hard because remember Egypt, they were all in their heart, some CC as you say, clinging on to the hope that Egypt could maybe be the savior, fight against the Babylon, and then deliver us. That's why he ended his last negative preaching, 4 chapters on Egypt. Egypt will fall and herself go down to Sheol. It is to say there is no hope in that airline, and we will remain in exile for the next number of years. So I think the people find hard to accept. That's why the false prophets were prevalent in back home in Judah and also in Babylon. There were a lot of these false prophets preaching false messages. Back home, Jeremiah had to deal with one guy, Hananiah. Remember Hananiah took the horns, made of iron, and says, with this we will push the Babylonians back. You're also using prophetic sign act to act on his message. And Jeremiah had to challenge Hananiah and say, no, by end of this year, you will die. And that's why then proven to be false. So I think it was the people find hard to accept. And so that I think account for a lot of his prophetic sign act. He had to act out his message to demonstrate the message. And yet the people find it so hard to accept because they were like clinging to hope against hope, hoping that maybe even a small slender of hope, sliver of hope, they might return home. But Ezekiel, no, we are in for the long haul, 50 years. Okay. Why did the Lord allow this to happen to Ezekiel's wife? She could have died. No, I think she could have died of natural cause. It is God withholding the husband from attending the funeral. That is the hard part. Because he has to act out. So it means it's like you get a glimpse of God's heart. You see how God loved the people, just as Ezekiel loved his wife, but at the funeral, God will turn his face. Remember earlier on, as I said, he made that clay model of the city. He lied up on his side for 390 days. And then he put a piece of iron to shield his face from the city, as if to say, your sins have prevented me from looking. So God no longer lifts up his countenance upon his people. The Aaronic priestly prayer, number 633, the Lord lift up his countenance upon us and be gracious to us. Here, God turned his countenance away. Ezekiel was playing the role of God, and like God turned his face away, Ezekiel turned away from his wife, didn't even come to the funeral as if to say, God is not looking at the destruction of the city. The city will fall and be destroyed, and God is not going to mourn. It must have been very tough for Ezekiel to mourn in private and not seeing the wife for one last time before she was buried. So I think nothing cruel on the wife's part. I think people die, but it's the timing of the death. And God used it. And so God said, you act it out, even that. Even that, I think the people find it hard. Until that man with the news comes and then only finally vindicates Ezekiel's preaching for all the years. Another question, throughout the history of Israel and Judah, we see that there is an over-reliance on Egypt. Why didn't the leaders learn from the lessons in the past? You see, Egypt was a superpower. And in the West, the new superpowers that arose came from the East. Assyria, number 1, Babylon, number 2, Persia, number 3. And then after that, the superpowers will swing back to the West, to Greece in the West and Rome in the West. So for a long time, Egypt was like a counterbalance to Assyria. And that's why Pharaoh Necho went to meet the Assyrian king at Megiddo to fight. And our poor fellow Josiah thought he didn't want both kings to win. See, if Pharaoh Necho wins, then Egypt becomes big boss, big neighbor, big brother on my side. If Exile wins, Exile becomes a big brother on the east side. So he tried to intervene in the in Megiddo, but he lost his life there. In fact, Pharaoh Necho told Josiah, "Stay out. This is not your business." So they saw Egypt as a counterbalance. Assyria is rising up, and the kings of Assyria are very great. Remember the names of Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser IV. Okay, so who to counter? Only Egypt. So they had to always rely on Egypt. But in the preaching of even Isaiah in the 8th century, Isaiah had this wonderful passage. Who are the Egyptians? They are not gods, they are men, flesh and blood. And then he says it is in returning and in rest, in quietness and in trust. That's where you see salvation. But they were frantically making political alliances with Egypt. For the time of the 8th century, there was this political pro-Egyptian party trying to get even Hezekiah in his younger days to be pro-Egyptian. By the time come to the 6th century, Zedekiah was still being wooed by the pro-Egyptian party. Well, the people never learned the lesson. Also maybe because they had very little choice. Who can you ally with? So all the neighboring countries actually make a coalition to try to stem the Assyrians in the 8th century. They failed. They lost the battle at Carchemish. When the Babylonians came, they tried again to stem by holding a coalition. That's why Tyre and Sidon all get hammered because they were all in the coalition to force. And Egypt always at the back end, always say, go ahead. You all man the front, I'm at the back. But Egypt never come on. We know from history, the Egyptian armies always either come late or never turn up in the battlefield. Let you guys get slaughtered first. They are smart. And that's why the prophets warn the people, don't look to Egypt. But Egypt sounds so nice. Humanly, it's like, like today, maybe we should make political alliance with Buddha, Bersatu. If we do that, I think we never learn our lessons from scripture applied to our nation today. Once beaten, twice shy. You still want to make alliance with Pejuang, Bersatu, Pass? You'd be crazy to do all these things, you see. But somehow, that lessons, like Ezekiel used a lot of history lessons. You guys never learn. You go back and prostitute yourself to the same old people again and again and again and again. So I think we have to learn from history, because I think Malaysia, we are repeating history again. We have gone back to the same pattern again and again. Okay, I think that's all the questions I have on the chat.
Yes, that's it for the questions. So thank you so much, Rabbi, for this session. So we will see you again next week at 11:15. For those of you at Studio One or joining us physically in PJAFC, please take note that we will be live streaming this talk to you next week. There's no need to register. Another thing is notes. I know we all have notes. Come and look for me. Yeah, I have the notes. I'll pass to you.
Okay.
My number, just ask. Give me your email address.
Go back and read 33 to 48, the final.
Yes.
Okay.
Final challenge, read Ezekiel 33 to 48. You can finish in a few hours, trust me. So thank you so much, Rabbi, once again for your words of wisdom. I ask Reverend Dickey to close us in a word of prayer.